Hi, this is Mr. Roberts with 8th grade English. Today I'm going to talk to you about annotation, or figuring out what a text really says. So before we get too far into it, hopefully your teachers have been talking to you about annotation, maybe they've had you use it, maybe it's something you're familiar with from the past, and you'll remember that annotation is just a close reading strategy that makes you take the thoughts and feelings and connections that you've got to a piece of writing from your brain and put them onto the paper by writing them down. It is okay to write on a text. Now, if it's a school-owned textbook, like the history books that y'all like to draw mustaches on the pictures in, not really okay. But if it's something that we give you, like an article or a short story, or even the state test booklets that you've got for 3 or 4 or 5 hours for one day at the end of the year, write on it. Take your thoughts and put them on the paper. Help to make sense of what you're really reading. So some of you are wondering, well, why should I use this? There's the number one clear reason for a lot of you. That's because your teachers are making you do it. But to be serious, there is personal benefit to you to use annotation because it helps you connect with what you're reading. It helps if you put your notes on the margin right there next to what the author is saying. It helps you to better understand what you're reading. Also helps you make sense of it later on. If you take notes on an article in class and then go back home and study it and reread it, and you don't really remember what it was you were talking about because you didn't write it down, it's not going to help you out very much. Lastly, if you practice annotation now, when you get to high school, when you get to college, or to your job if you choose to go that route, you're going to have a leg up on the competition. You're going to know this skill already and be familiar with it, and hopefully it's become like second nature, and it gives you an advantage on other people who don't really use it. So we need to remember that annotation is a two-part process. It's something called coding, along with writing your thoughts in the margin. Now, coding is just using specific symbols that have a meaning next to certain sections of the text, whether it be a word, a phrase, or a whole paragraph, that tell you you need to go back and focus on these later because you had something in your mind that you thought was important. Now, the big thing to remember with annotation is that if you just code the text, use all these symbols, and you don't write something in the margin, that's not annotation. It's going to look like a bunch of scribbles and doodles later on when you go to look at it because you won't have written anything down to make sense of those symbols. So let's go ahead and take a look at all of these symbols. Hopefully you remember this page. Your teacher gave you a copy of it, expected you to put it in your binder and hold on to it. Until you get these symbols memorized and you're very familiar with them, keep it, reference it, use it over and over. That's why we make you the copies. Let's take a look at the first one, decoding the circle. So that's what we use for words that we don't know, or words that are very powerful that stick out to us. Phrases too. Make sure when you go through and you're looking for these words that you take the time to look up the words that you don't know. That way when you go back and reread the text, you'll understand it. And notice I said reread because you can't just read a text one time and get everything you're going to need from it. When you're coding and annotating and trying to closely read something, you've got to do it 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 or more times to really understand what is being written. Also, when you circle these words, it helps you to understand the message the author is trying to get across. So the way that we annotate this is by writing down the meaning of the word, or if it's something that you already know, write down the effect that this creates because the author used it. Let's go on to underline. This is the one that most of us use. Some of us overuse it. We underline the keywords or the phrases, and highlighting is okay too if you happen to have a highlighter. When you're doing this, make sure that you're very, very picky and particular about what you underline. Because if you underline everything, then nothing sticks out. Nothing looks important. It just is all underlined, or you've got a bright yellow sheet of paper that doesn't really make much sense because nothing sticks out from it. This also helps you understand the author's intended message and purpose. Also, if you're writing or having a discussion on it, which most of your reading is going to have, you're going to have your text-based evidence already identified so that all you have to do is point to it instead of scanning back through every time you're trying to make a point. So the way we annotate this is just explain why you underlined or highlighted those keywords or phrases. Let's move on to the question mark. It's pretty self-explanatory. Anything that raises a question in your mind as you read, write that question down. And then if you are reading further on and you come across the answer to your question, make a note to go back to it. find some way of either drawing an arrow, writing the whole answer down, or you could even go just write C paragraph 5 if that's where the answer was found. And you annotate this by writing down the question. Also, if you found the answer, put it there as well. Alright, with the exclamation point, just like when you talk or when you write, something that excites you or surprises you, you want to show emotion, that's how you're going to show it here. If you weren't expecting something that you read or something that surprised you, write down the exclamation and then explain how or what it was that caught your attention. With the connections, you've got 7 years or more worth of school under your belt. You've also got 12, 13, 14 years of life, so you've experienced things in your life. You've done reading, you've watched movies, you've watched shows. There are ideas that you've had, experiences that you or other people you know, and then you're aware of the world history or the things that are going on in today's world. So when you read, keep those things in mind and write down your connections, because the more connections to other things you have, the more likely you are to remember it, because it becomes like a giant spider web of connections to help you keep all these things in mind. We're going to move on to decoding the smiley or the plus sign. This is things that you agree with. Usually with argumentative writing, if you're doing an informative piece, you're trying to support an analysis of something, you would use this as your text-based evidence, all those things that you agree with. And you annotate by explaining why you agree with this text. Now on the flip side of the coin, if we had a smiley face, there's got to be a sad face. If there was a plus sign, there's got to be a minus. And these are things that show that you disagree with something the author had said. You use it the same way in argumentative or informative writing, and you annotate by explaining why you disagree with it. Lastly, we've got the stars. These are the ones that show your most important ideas. These are the things that you take away, the things that stick with you. I recommend that you wait until after you've done all the other coding, so that when you do choose your stars, you do really know these are the most critical, important pieces of information. I also say you should limit it to 3 to 5 stars just to make sure, again, that what you're saying is important, really is important. Also, if you're using this in a discussion, you're not going to be the person who only has one piece, and so when it's your turn, you don't have anything to say. But if you limit it to 3 or 5, then you're not the person that takes over the discussion, and everybody else kind of looks at you crazy because you've completely hijacked what all of them were going to say. You annotate this by paraphrasing the points. Notice I didn't say copy or write them down again. You paraphrase, because when you put it into your own words, your brain has to process it and translate it from the author's to your words, and that proves that you really understand what you're talking about. And then you can go a step further if you want, do a graffiti or make a symbol or picture to represent what you're talking about. Finally, we're going to wrap up with just remembering that if you code something without writing in the margins, it's not annotation. It's just, like I said, a bunch of doodles. So hopefully you will use this strategy. It's going to be beneficial to you. We're going to go ahead and transition now to my second video.